The map that broke the region. Most people are taught that the Middle East is unstable because of ancient rivalries, religion, tribes, conflicts said to be thousands of years old. That explanation is not just wrong, it is convenient, because it shifts responsibility away from decisions that can be named, dated, and traced. The modern Middle East did not fracture because of history stretching too far back. It fractured because of choices made barely a century ago, in the middle of a global war, by officials drawing borders they would never have to defend, in societies they would never have to govern. The instability that defines the region today was not inherited, it was designed. To understand why peace never took root, we don't need to look deeper into the past. We need to look closer. At the moment, the modern Middle East was created. Before the First World War, the Middle East did not exist as a collection of nation-states. There was no Iraq, no Syria, no Jordan, no Lebanon. Instead, most of the region was governed by the Ottoman Empire, ruled from Istanbul for more than 400 years. This system was not democratic. Authority was centralized, uneven, and often authoritarian. But it possessed something the modern system would lack: continuity. Borders were not rigid lines. They were zones of influence that shifted gradually over time. Identity was layered rather than singular, tribal, religious, local, and imperial at once. Loyalty was not primarily to a flag or a nation. It was to community, empire, and survival. The Ottoman structure managed diversity by absorbing it, not by forcing it into fixed political containers. Conflict existed, but it was mediated within a broader imperial framework that provided a degree of stability. That framework would not survive the First World War. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was weakening. European powers referred to it as the sick man of Europe, already anticipating its collapse. When the war began in 1914, the empire entered the conflict on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. As the war dragged on, British and French leaders were no longer asking whether the empire would survive, but what would replace it. The answer was not independence, it was reorganization. And that reorganization would happen without the participation of the people who lived there. In 1916, in the middle of the war, Britain and France negotiated a secret agreement to divide Ottoman territories between themselves. It became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France drew lines across a map of lands they barely knew. Those lines were not designed to reflect ethnic boundaries, religious communities, historical governance, or economic realities. They were drawn for imperial convenience. France would control what became Syria and Lebanon. Britain would control Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. The borders ignored how people lived, traded, worshipped, and governed themselves. They assumed political authority could simply be imposed, and that stability would follow. This was not peace planning, it was administrative division, and it treated the region not as a living society, but as territory to be managed. At the same time Britain was negotiating with France, it was making other promises, promises that could not coexist. In 1915, British officials encouraged Arab leaders to revolt against Ottoman rule, implying support for Arab independence once the war ended. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, supporting the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Each promise made sense in isolation. Together, they were incompatible. Britain had promised the same land to different peoples and postponed dealing with the contradiction. The assumption was that power on the ground would eventually resolve ambiguity. Instead, ambiguity became permanent. By 1918, the war ended. Ottoman authority collapsed almost overnight. British troops entered Jerusalem. French forces moved into Damascus. For local populations, this moment carried enormous expectation. Many believed independence had finally arrived, Instead, they received mandates. Under the League of Nations, Britain and France were granted authority to govern former Ottoman territories until they were supposedly ready for self-rule. The language suggested guidance. The reality was control. Britain governed Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan. France governed Syria and Lebanon. These political units were created quickly and artificially. They lacked shared identity, institutional trust, and broadly accepted legitimacy. States were born before nations existed, and from the beginning they depended on external power to survive. Promises without resolution. By the early 1920s, the modern Middle East was officially mapped. Borders existed, flags followed, governments were installed, but legitimacy did not. The region entered the international system not through negotiated settlement, but through administrative decision. What appeared as order on paper concealed instability beneath the surface. The borders were real. Acceptance of those borders was not. This was not a temporary flaw. It was structural. And once this structure was in place, conflict no longer required ideology or extremism to emerge. It was embedded in the foundation itself. From this point forward, every attempt at peace would have to operate inside a system built without consent, without reconciliation, and without a shared sense of political belonging. That system would not collapse immediately, but it would never truly stabilize. The unresolved core. By the early 1920s, the political map of the Middle East had been drawn. But one territory absorbed more contradictions than any other: Palestine. Under British rule, Palestine became the point where every unresolved promise converged: imperial strategy, competing national projects, demographic change without political consent. For Britain, the mandate was a balancing act. For the people living there, it was a slow collision. Jewish immigration increased steadily throughout the 1920s and 1930s, driven by persecution in Europe and encouraged by international support for a Jewish homeland. Arab Palestinians watched the population shift, while political authority remained in British hands. Two communities were growing under the same administration, with incompatible expectations about the future. Britain attempted to manage both. It satisfied neither. Tensions hardened into hostility. Strikes, riots, and cycles of violence became periodic. Each response deepened mistrust. By the late 1930s, it was clear that the mandate system had failed to produce legitimacy. Britain could govern the territory. It could not reconcile it. As the Second World War ended, Britain's capacity to manage Palestine collapsed. Exhausted economically and politically, London sought an exit. The problem was transferred to a new international body, the United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan for Palestine. The territory would be divided into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. On paper, the plan appeared balanced. In practice, it repeated a familiar pattern. The proposal passed in the General Assembly, but legitimacy was not created by a vote in New York. Jewish leaders accepted the plan as a legal foundation for statehood. Arab leaders rejected it as another externally imposed solution that ignored demographic realities and political consent. Once again, a political future was decided without agreement among those who would have to live with it. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence. Within hours, war began. Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon intervened militarily. What followed was not a brief clash. It was the first full-scale regional war of the modern Middle East. When the fighting ended, Israel had survived and expanded beyond the borders proposed by the United Nations. Statehood was consolidated through military victory. For Palestinians, the outcome carried a different meaning. Over 700,000 people were displaced. Entire communities were emptied. A refugee population was created, one that would remain unresolved for decades. This moment became known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. From the very beginning, war produced facts on the ground faster than diplomacy could respond. When war replaced negotiation. The 1948 war established a pattern that would define the region. Military outcomes replaced negotiated settlements. Borders shifted through force, not agreement. Armistice lines were drawn, but peace treaties did not follow. This distinction mattered. Armistice froze conflict. Peace would have required reconciliation. Instead, all sides interpreted the outcome as temporary. Israel prepared for survival. Arab states prepared for reversal. The conflict did not end. It paused. In the years that followed, regional politics became increasingly militarized. Defense spending rose. Armies expanded. Security doctrine moved to the center of political decision-making. Governments tied legitimacy to resistance rather than governance. Military institutions gained political influence. Civil development became secondary. This shift narrowed the space for diplomacy. Compromise stopped being a political skill. It became a liability. In 1956, the illusion of regional sovereignty was tested again, when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France moved to reclaim control. Israel joined them in a coordinated military operation. Militarily, the invasion succeeded. Politically, it collapsed. Under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, the invading forces withdrew. The crisis marked a transition. European imperial dominance ended. Superpower involvement began. The Middle East was no longer just a regional problem. It became a theater of global rivalry. The Six-Day War of June 1967 accelerated this transformation. In less than a week, Israel captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The territorial map changed overnight. Legitimacy did not follow. Occupation replaced borders. What had once been an interstate conflict became a prolonged struggle over land, identity, and rights. Israel now controlled territories populated by millions of Palestinians. The question of statehood could no longer be postponed. Occupation was initially framed as temporary. It became permanent. Settlements expanded. Administrative control deepened. Military governance replaced civilian negotiation. For Israel, occupation offered security depth. For Palestinians, it eliminated political agency. Negotiations occurred under unequal conditions. Trust eroded. Violence became cyclical rather than exceptional. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack during Yom Kippur. Their objective was not total victory, it was strategic disruption. Militarily, Israel eventually regained the upper hand. Politically, the impact was profound. The war demonstrated that military dominance did not guarantee deterrence. It also forced external powers to reassess stability in the region. For the first time, war did not redraw borders, but it did redraw assumptions. By the end of this period, a new reality had taken shape. War had become the primary instrument of change. Negotiation followed violence, not the other way around. Peace existed only as an interruption between conflicts, not as a foundation. The region had learned a lesson that would shape everything that followed. Force could alter outcomes, but it could not produce closure. When conflict went indirect. By the late 1970s, the structure of conflict in the Middle East began to change. Direct wars between states had proven costly, unpredictable, and politically dangerous. They altered borders, but they rarely delivered resolution. They produced victories without closure. At the same time, external involvement was increasing. Global powers were no longer occasional participants. They were becoming permanent actors. This combination forced a strategic shift. Conflict did not disappear. It adapted. One moment symbolized this transition more clearly than any other. In 1979, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty. For the first time, the region's strongest Arab military power formally exited the cycle of direct war with Israel. The agreement worked, narrowly. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt. Large-scale interstate war between the two countries ended, but the consequences were revealing. Egypt was isolated by much of the Arab world. Its regional leadership diminished. Peace proved possible but costly. More importantly, the treaty did not resolve the broader conflict. It addressed a state-to-state dispute. It did not address occupation, refugees, or legitimacy. Peace existed, but it did not spread. In the same year, a very different transformation took place. In Iran, a revolution overthrew the Shah and dismantled a Western-backed monarchy. The country emerged as an ideological state, redefining its role in the region. Under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, Iran rejected the legitimacy of the regional order, created after the First World War and reinforced by Western power. This rejection was not rhetorical, it was strategic. Iran framed itself as a revolutionary force whose mission extended beyond its borders. Israel was not treated as a conventional rival. It was framed as a structural injustice, a Western-backed project embedded in the region. This framing mattered. It did not require immediate war. It justified permanent confrontation. Iran's leadership also understood its limitations. Direct war against Israel or against the United States was never a realistic option. Iran lacked air superiority. It lacked regional allies with conventional strength. It faced economic isolation almost immediately after the revolution. A direct confrontation would have been short and disastrous. So Iranian strategists reached a different conclusion. If power could not be projected through armies, it could be projected through networks. If borders were unreachable, influence could still move through societies. Time, not territory, would become the central weapon. This logic gave rise to a strategy that would reshape the region: proxy warfare. Indirect conflict offered several advantages. First, deniability. Support could be provided without formal declarations of war. Second, flexibility. Pressure could be increased or reduced depending on circumstances. Third, efficiency. Supporting non-state actors was far cheaper than maintaining standing armies. Most importantly, proxy warfare allowed influence without ownership. Responsibility became blurred. Escalation became manageable. Peace became fragile by design. The first full expression of this strategy appeared in Lebanon. Following Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the country's fragmented political system created ideal conditions for indirect influence. Iranian advisors from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps helped organize a new Shiite movement, Hezbollah. Hezbollah was not designed to win decisive battles. It was designed to endure. It combined armed resistance with political participation, welfare services, and ideological discipline. This combination allowed it to embed itself deeply within Lebanese society. Conflict became normalized. Resolution became distant. What mattered was not victory. It was persistence. The success of this model did not go unnoticed. Iran began supporting groups that shared three characteristics: local legitimacy, ideological alignment, willingness to operate indefinitely over time. This network expanded. In Iraq, militias emerged as power brokers. In Syria, Iran embedded itself within the state's security apparatus. In Yemen, the Houthis became a pressure point against regional rivals. Each front operated independently, yet all were strategically connected. Conflict no longer moved in straight lines, it spread laterally. While Iran refined its indirect strategy, it was simultaneously shaped by one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history. In 1980, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. The war lasted 8 years. More than 1 million people were killed. Chemical weapons were used, cities were bombed. Civilian suffering became routine. When the war ended in 1988, borders remained unchanged. But something else had changed. The region's tolerance for violence had increased dramatically. War had proven that survival depended not on resolution, but on endurance. For Iran, the lesson was clear. Conventional war was expensive, unpredictable, and exhausting. Indirect pressure was sustainable. Instead of decisive victories, long-term leverage became the objective. Instead of territorial conquest, strategic depth. Time itself became a weapon. As Iran expanded indirectly, the United States expanded directly. The 1991 Gulf War marked the beginning of a permanent American military presence in the Middle East. Bases were established. Naval forces remained deployed. Security partnerships deepened. From Washington's perspective, this presence was meant to stabilize the region. From regional perspectives, it became another variable to manage. American dominance altered incentives. Direct confrontation became risky. Asymmetric resistance became attractive. Militias and non-state actors gained relevance precisely because they could challenge power without triggering full-scale war. The stronger the external presence, the more valuable deniable actors became. Stability was enforced tactically, but undermined strategically. The consequences of this system became unmistakable in 2003. The invasion of Iraq dismantled the country's central authority without replacing it with a cohesive alternative. Institutions collapsed. Sectarian identities filled the vacuum. Power fragmented. For Iran, Iraq shifted from a buffer into a corridor. For the region, instability became contagious. Conflict no longer needed to be exported. It reproduced itself. This process reached its peak with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011. What began as domestic protest escalated into international confrontation. Iran intervened to preserve the Assad regime. Russia entered militarily in 2015. The United States supported selected opposition forces. Regional powers pursued competing agendas. No actor controlled the conflict. No settlement satisfied all stakeholders. Responsibility dispersed. Violence relocated rather than ended. Ending one front did not end the conflict, it displaced it. By the 2010s, Middle Eastern conflict had acquired a recognizable structure. Indirect confrontation, multiple overlapping actors, blurred responsibility, long timelines. This structure rewarded persistence over compromise. Peace threatened leverage. Instability sustained influence. After this era, the question was no longer why wars started. It was why they could not stop. The system itself resisted closure. When conflict became a system. By the early 21st century, conflict in the Middle East was no longer an anomaly. It had become a system. Wars were no longer discrete events with clear beginnings and endings. They were managed processes, prolonged, contained, and strategically maintained. Every major actor adapted to this reality. States planned around instability. Militias depended on it. External powers learned to contain conflict rather than resolve it. Peace stopped being the default objective. Manageable instability replaced it. Military force had reshaped the Middle East repeatedly. It had redrawn borders, toppled governments, destroyed organizations, but it had never produced lasting peace, because force treats symptoms, not structure. Armies can defeat enemies. They cannot manufacture legitimacy. Every military victory in the region solved one problem while creating several others. Security improved tactically. Instability deepened strategically. Force created control. It did not create consent. Diplomacy failed for a different reason, not because negotiation was impossible, but because it operated on unstable foundations. Most peace initiatives focused on ceasefires, territorial arrangements, power-sharing formulas. They rarely addressed legitimacy, identity, regional power imbalance, external interference. Agreements froze conflicts. They did not dissolve them. Treaties managed timing. They did not resolve causes. Each agreement depended on conditions that rarely held for long: stable leadership, balanced power, and limited external interference. In the Middle East, those conditions shifted constantly. When they shifted, agreements weakened. And when agreements weakened, violence returned. At the center of every unresolved conflict lay the same problem: legitimacy. Borders lacked broad acceptance. Governments struggled to command trust. Institutions were viewed as imposed rather than earned. In such environments, opposition did not disappear. It reorganized. Groups gained support not because they promised peace, but because they promised resistance. This made compromise politically dangerous. Leaders who negotiated risked being seen as illegitimate. Leaders who resisted gained credibility. The system rewarded confrontation. Another structural barrier was the imbalance of power across the region. Some states possessed advanced militaries and external backing. Others relied on militias, ideology, or proxy support. This imbalance distorted negotiation. Weaker actors avoided final settlements. Stronger actors avoided concessions. Stalemate became safer than resolution. Conflict persisted not because no one wanted peace, but because no outcome felt acceptable to all sides. External powers reinforced this dynamic. The Middle East was never left alone to resolve its own conflicts. Outside actors intervened to protect allies, secure energy routes, counter rivals, maintain influence. These interventions were often framed as stabilizing. In practice, they froze existing power structures. External guarantees reduced incentives for compromise. External pressure distorted local accountability. Peace became conditional on outside approval, and outside interests rarely aligned perfectly with local resolution. Economic pressure was often presented as an alternative to war. Sanctions, aid conditionality, financial leverage, they rarely delivered peace. Economic pressure weakened societies faster than it weakened power structures. Populations suffered, elites adapted. Informal economies expanded, grievance deepened. Rather than producing compromise, pressure often strengthened hardline narratives. Conflict did not soften, it hardened. Conflict in the Middle East was not only political, it was historical. Memory played an active role. Past wars were not closed chapters. They were referenced constantly. Each generation inherited unresolved grievances. Narratives of loss, betrayal, and resistance shaped political behavior. This did not make peace impossible, but it made forgetting impossible. In many regions, time softens disputes. In the Middle East, time accumulated them because conflicts were not resolved. only suspended. Each pause added another layer of grievance. Each failed agreement became evidence against future ones. Time deepened mistrust rather than erasing it. Ending conflict in the Middle East would require changes that were difficult, slow, and politically costly. It would require borders broadly accepted institutions seen as legitimate reduced external interference, regional security frameworks that included rivals. None of these emerged quickly, none benefited all actors equally, and none could be imposed militarily. The region was exhausted by war, but exhaustion alone did not create peace. Because conflict had become embedded in political survival, many actors derived legitimacy, leverage, or protection from continued instability. Ending conflict would require redistributing power. Those who benefited from the current structure resisted that redistribution. The central conclusion. The Middle East did not lack peace initiatives. It lacked the conditions required to sustain peace. As long as conflict remained a functional system for states, militias, and external powers, resolution would remain elusive. Peace was not absent because it had never been attempted. It was absent because the system resisted it. Until the structures that rewarded confrontation changed, the Middle East would continue to experience cycles of war without closure. Not because peace was impossible, but because it was structurally discouraged.